The doctor said her baby would be defective. 20 years later, that same company was dying and only her defective son could save it. But here's what they didn't know. She'd kept every lie they told, every forged document, every whispered insult about her age. And now they were about to pay for all of it. Jennifer Caballero's phone hadn't rung in 3 years. Not from anyone at Caps Global, anyway. Not from the colleagues who used to ask her opinion on million-dollar deals. Not from the assistants who once lined up outside her office. And certainly not from Robert. She'd made peace with that. Or so she told herself every morning while brewing coffee in the modest kitchen of the 2-bedroom apartment she shared with Albert, her son, her world, her proof that she hadn't been too old for anything. But tonight, staring at the news alert lighting up her laptop screen, Jennifer felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 20 years. Satisfaction. Billionaire CEO Robert Capps collapses during shareholder meeting. The headline glowed against the dark kitchen. Jennifer read it twice, then a third time. She wasn't proud of the small smile that tugged at her lips, but she didn't fight it either. Let them panic, she thought. Let them scramble. She closed the laptop and turned toward the hallway, where soft light spilled from Albert's room. He was still awake. He was always awake. Her boy didn't sleep like other people. He thought too much, saw too much, felt everything the world tried to ignore. "Mom?" Albert's voice drifted through the cracked door. "You okay?" Jennifer wiped her face quickly, surprised to find it damp. "I'm fine, baby." "You're lying." She laughed, sharp and tired. Of course he knew. Albert always knew. She pushed the door open and found him exactly where she expected. Hunched over his desk, 3 monitors glowing with code she couldn't begin to understand. A half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside a disassembled hard drive. "You need to eat," Jennifer said softly. "I did eat, 4 hours ago. That doesn't count." Albert finally looked up, and Jennifer's heart did what it always did when she saw those eyes. Robert's eyes, sharp and storm gray. The only thing her son had inherited from a man who didn't deserve him. "You saw the news," Albert said. It wasn't a question. Jennifer hesitated. She'd worked so hard to keep Robert's world separate from theirs. She never spoke his name. Never let bitterness poison the air, Albert breathed. But her son was 20 now, brilliant, observant, and far too good at reading the things she didn't say. "I saw it," Jennifer admitted. And nothing. It has nothing to do with us." Albert studied her for a long moment, then turned back to his screens. "You're lying again." 20 years earlier, Jennifer had been someone else entirely. Sharp. Untouchable. The woman every executive at Caps Global either wanted to impress or feared disappointing. She'd been Robert's right hand before she'd been anything else, the strategist who'd helped him turn a struggling tech firm into an empire. They'd started as colleagues, then friends, then something she still didn't have a word for. It had never been simple with Robert. He was brilliant and brutal, visionary and cold. But when he looked at her across a conference table, when he asked her opinion and actually listened, Jennifer had felt something she'd convinced herself she didn't need. Seen. And then she'd gotten pregnant. The memory still played like a film reel she couldn't shut off. Jennifer standing in Robert's corner office, hands shaking, trying to find the words. She'd rehearsed it a dozen times, thought she was ready. She wasn't. Robert had gone completely still when she told him the kind of still that meant his mind was already racing, already calculating, already building walls. "I didn't plan this," Jennifer had said, hating how small her voice sounded. "But I'm keeping the baby. I wanted you to know." Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Then Robert spoke, and 5 words destroyed everything. "You can't give me an heir." Jennifer blinked. "What?" "You're 43, Jennifer." Robert's voice was quiet, clinical. "The board is already questioning my judgment. A child from an unofficial relationship with someone your age? It's a liability I can't afford." She'd stood there, frozen, while Robert turned back to his desk as if she'd already left. As if she'd already ceased to exist. "If you've ever been dismissed because of your age, if someone ever looked at you and decided you were too old for your dreams, your career, or your worth, you're not alone. That feeling of being erased, thousands of women watching this right now know exactly what that's like. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button. Because we're building a community here where women finally get the recognition they deserved all along. You belong here." Jennifer had cleaned out her office that same night. No dramatic exit, no confrontation. She simply packed her files into a single box, left her keycard on the desk, and walked out of Caps Global with her head high and her heart shattered. 3 people had seen her leave. None of them said goodbye. Albert was born 6 months later, small, quiet, and watchful in ways that unnerved the nurses. He didn't cry like other newborns. He stared, absorbed, studied the world like it was a puzzle he was already solving. Jennifer had loved him instantly and ferociously. But the world hadn't been kind. Neighbors whispered that Albert was slow because he didn't speak until he was 3. Teachers suggested he needed special programs because he didn't socialize. Other children avoided him because he was weird. But Jennifer saw the truth they all missed. Albert wasn't slow. He was waiting until he had something worth saying. At 6 years old, Albert had rebuilt a broken radio Jennifer had thrown in the trash. At 10, he'd hacked into his school's computer system, not to cause trouble, but to fix a scheduling error that had been frustrating students for weeks. At 15, he'd taught himself 4 programming languages and designed an algorithm that could predict server failures before they happened. And now, at 20, Albert spent his nights creating systems that no one had asked for, solving problems that no one else had noticed, building brilliance in the dark while the world called him useless. Jennifer knew better. She'd always known. But she'd also learned to protect him from a world that didn't understand genius when it came quietly. Back in the present, Jennifer watched Albert's fingers fly across the keyboard, lines of code appearing faster than she could track. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Predictive modeling for infrastructure failure," Albert said absently. "There's a gap in how municipalities track utility stress. I'm fixing it." "Did someone hire you to fix it?" "No." "Then why?" "Because it's broken, Mom." Albert finally looked at her, and there was something almost sad in his expression. "If I see something broken, I have to fix it. That's just how I'm built." Jennifer's throat tightened. "That's how I'm built." That was Robert's logic, Robert's drive. But wrapped in kindness Robert had never possessed. "You're not broken, baby," Jennifer whispered. "I know." Albert's small smile was genuine. "You remind me every day." Jennifer was about to respond when her phone buzzed, a sound so unexpected she actually jumped. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something instinct, curiosity, maybe just exhaustion, made her swipe to accept. "Hello?" The voice on the other end made her blood turn to ice. "Jennifer, it's Paul Mendoza. We need to talk. It's about Robert and your son." The room tilted. Albert looked up sharply, already reading the shift in her expression. "Who is it?" he asked. Jennifer couldn't answer, because after 20 years of silence, the empire that had erased her was calling. And she had no idea why. But she was about to find out. And what Paul Mendoza was about to tell her would change everything, not just for Robert's crumbling empire, but for the son they'd spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist. Robert Capps had built an empire on the principle that weakness was unforgivable. So waking up in a private clinic with an IV in his arm and his CFO standing over him like a pallbearer felt like the ultimate betrayal of his body, his image, and everything he'd spent 40 years constructing. "How long was I out?" Robert's voice came out rougher than he intended. Paul Mendoza didn't sugarcoat it. 7 minutes during the meeting. 3 hours since we brought you here. The board saw everything. Paul's expression was unreadable. The footage is already on financial news sites. Stock dropped 11% in 2 hours. Robert closed his eyes, fury rising in his chest like bile. 11%. 7 minutes of human frailty had cost his shareholders billions. "Get me out of here," Robert said, already reaching for the IV. "No." Paul's hand shot out, stopping him. "You're not leaving until you hear what I have to say. And trust me, Robert, you need to be sitting down for this." There was something in Paul's tone that made Robert freeze. In 20 years of working together, Paul had never used that voice. The one that said the ground beneath them was already crumbling. "What aren't you telling me?" Robert asked slowly. Paul pulled a chair close to the hospital bed, sitting in a way that felt rehearsed, prepared, like he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "The company is failing, Robert." Silence. "That's not possible. I reviewed the quarterly reports myself. The reports are lies." Paul's voice was flat, factual. I've been covering the hemorrhaging for 18 months. We've been moving numbers, delaying disclosures, restructuring debt to keep the illusion alive. But we're out of time. Robert felt the heart monitor beside him spike. You've been what? Keeping your empire from collapsing while you played king. Paul leaned forward, and for the first time, Robert saw something he'd never seen in his CFO's eyes before. Contempt. Caps Global is rotting from the inside out. 3 of our largest contracts are about to default. Our infrastructure systems are outdated by a decade. Competitors have been quietly poaching our best engineers for 2 years, and the board knows all of it now. Robert's hands gripped the bedsheets. Why wasn't I told? You were told. Repeatedly. You ignored every warning because admitting vulnerability isn't in your DNA. The words landed like physical blows. Paul pulled a tablet from his briefcase and placed it on Robert's lap. Financial projections glowed on the screen. All red, all plummeting, all catastrophic. The board held an emergency meeting while you were unconscious, Paul continued. They've given you an ultimatum. Name a successor within 6 months, or they'll remove you and appoint their own. A successor. Robert's laugh was bitter. I'm 58 years old. I don't need a successor. I need time to fix this. You don't have time. And frankly, Robert, you don't have the answer. Paul's voice softened slightly, but the truth in it was sharp as glass. This company needs someone who understands the systems you refuse to modernize. Someone who can rebuild infrastructure you let decay. Someone with a mind brilliant enough to untangle the mess we're in. And where exactly do you suggest I find this miracle worker? Paul reached into his briefcase again, slower this time. He pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. He placed it carefully on Robert's lap. Robert looked down at the label, Albert Caballero. The name hit him like a freight train. No, the word came out strangled. Absolutely not. You haven't even looked at what's inside. I don't need to. Robert shoved the folder back toward Paul, but his hands were shaking. That boy is nothing to me. He's your son. Paul's voice was steel, and the only person who can save this company. Robert's vision blurred at the edges. 20 years. He'd spent 20 years not thinking about Jennifer, not thinking about the decision he'd made, not thinking about the child he'd refused to acknowledge. And now that ghost was sitting on his lap in a manila folder, demanding to be seen. He's 20 years old, Robert said through gritted teeth. He has no experience, no training, no understanding of him. He has everything you don't. Paul opened the folder himself, forcing Robert to see. At 16, Albert designed a predictive algorithm for infrastructure failure that's more sophisticated than anything our entire engineering team has produced. At 18, he built a financial modeling system that caught 3 major accounting errors in public companies' errors their own auditors missed. At 19, he published a white paper on sustainable tech systems, under a pseudonym that's now required reading at MIT. Robert stared at the documents. Charts, code samples. A photograph of a young man with dark hair and storm gray eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. His chest tightened. Jennifer's son, Robert whispered. Your son, Paul corrected. And before you tell me again that he's nothing, let me show you something else. Paul pulled out a second folder, this one older. The papers inside yellowed with age. 9 years ago, Jennifer sent you this. Paul's voice was quiet now, almost sad. She sent you samples of Albert's work, early projects he'd built, problems he'd solved. She wasn't asking for money or recognition. She just wanted you to know what your son was capable of. Robert's throat closed. You never opened it. Paul placed the folder beside the first one. It sat in your assistant's filing system for 9 years. Marked, irrelevant. You never even looked. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Robert reached for the old folder with trembling hands. Inside were printouts of code, handwritten notes in Jennifer's careful script, and a single photograph. A boy, maybe 11 years old, sitting at a desk surrounded by disassembled electronics. His face lit with concentration. He looks like me, Robert thought, and the realization felt like drowning. Why are you showing me this now? Robert's voice cracked. Because you're out of options. Paul stood, and for the first time in 2 decades, he looked at Robert not as an employee, but as someone delivering a eulogy. The board wants Albert. They've already done their research. They know what he's capable of, and they don't care about your past mistakes or your pride. He won't come. Robert's words were barely audible. Why would he help me? I abandoned him before he was even born. He probably won't, Paul agreed. But you're going to ask him anyway, because if you don't, you'll lose everything you built. And maybe, just maybe, you'll finally do the right thing for once in your miserable life. Paul walked toward the door, then paused. Jennifer protected that boy from you for 20 years, Paul said without turning around. She raised him to be everything you're not, kind, humble, brilliant, without cruelty. And now you need him. You need the son you threw away. The door clicked shut. Robert sat alone in the sterile clinic room, surrounded by machines monitoring his failing body and folders documenting his failing empire. He looked down at the photograph again. Albert Caballero. The boy with his eyes and Jennifer's heart. The heir he'd refused. The son he'd never known. You know what's interesting? Some mistakes don't show their full cost until decades later. If you're watching this and thinking about the choices that haunt you, the moments you wish you could take back, drop a comment below. Sometimes just saying it out loud to people who understand makes the weight a little lighter. We're all carrying something. You don't have to carry it alone. Robert's hands trembled not from illness, not from weakness, but from something far more devastating. Regret. Pure, bone-deep, 20 years too late regret. And as he stared at his son's name, written in Jennifer's handwriting, Robert realized something that terrified him more than losing his empire. He'd thrown away the only thing that had ever truly mattered. And he had no idea if he could ever get it back. But 500 miles away, Jennifer was staring at her own phone, Paul's words still echoing in her mind. And the question that would tear her world open was already forming. After 20 years of silence, why did Robert Capps suddenly care about the son he'd abandoned? And more importantly, what was she going to tell Albert? Albert Caballero had learned early that the world was kinder to people who stayed invisible. At 3:47 a.m., while most of the city slept, Albert sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of his bedroom floor, surrounded by the disassembled pieces of Mrs. Chen's laptop. She'd brought it to him 3 days ago, apologizing for bothering him, explaining that the Geek Squad wanted $400 for data recovery. Albert had fixed it in 40 minutes. But he hadn't told her yet. Instead, he'd spent the last 3 nights rebuilding her entire operating system, adding security protocols she didn't know existed, and organizing 15 years of family photos into albums labeled by date and location. He didn't charge for this kind of work, never had. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who thought in code the way other people thought in words. Lines of text scrolled past commands that would seem like gibberish to most people but read like poetry to Albert. "You're doing it again." Albert looked up to find Jennifer standing in his doorway, wrapped in her old blue robe, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Doing what?" he asked, though he already knew. "Fixing things for people who'll never know how much work you put in." Jennifer handed him a mug and sat beside him on the floor, the way she'd done since he was small. "Mrs. Chen asked for data recovery. You're giving her a complete system overhaul. Her security was vulnerable. Someone could have stolen her identity. And you couldn't sleep knowing that?" Albert shrugged, taking a sip of tea. It was too hot, but he didn't mind. His mother always made tea too hot, and he'd learned to love it that way. "If I can fix it, I should fix it," he said quietly. "That's just how I'm built." Jennifer's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You're allowed to do things halfway sometimes, baby. You're allowed to just be." But Albert didn't know how to do things halfway. His brain didn't work that way. When he saw a problem, it consumed him, turned over and over in his mind like a Rubik's Cube he couldn't put down until every side aligned perfectly. It's why he dropped out of community college after 1 semester. Not because he couldn't handle the work, but because watching professors teach outdated methods to students who'd never questioned them had made his skin crawl. He'd tried correcting a computer science professor once, gently suggesting a more efficient algorithm. The professor had smiled, condescending, dismissive. "That's creative thinking, Albert. But in the real world, we stick to established protocols." Albert had never raised his hand in that class again. He'd stopped going entirely 3 weeks later. Jennifer hadn't been angry, just sad in that quiet way that hurt worse than yelling. She'd asked him what he wanted to do instead, and Albert had told her the truth. I want to solve things nobody else can solve, but I want to do it alone. Because people made everything complicated. People had expectations, social rules, ways of being that Albert had never quite mastered. They wanted eye contact, and small talk, and explanations for why he was the way he was. His mother was the only person who'd never needed explanations. She just loved him, completely, without conditions. And some days, that felt like the only thing keeping him tethered to a world that had never quite wanted him. At 6:15 a.m., Albert walked to the corner store to buy milk. Mr. Harrison was restocking shelves, and he looked up when Albert entered, his expression shifting the way it always did, polite but guarded. Like Albert was something fragile that might break if handled incorrectly. "Morning, Albert." "Morning. How's your mom?" "Good." The conversation died there, the way it always did. Mr. Harrison turned back to his shelves, and Albert grabbed the milk, paid, and left. Outside, Mrs. Rodriguez was walking her terrier. She saw Albert and crossed to the other side of the street. Not obviously, not rudely, just away. Albert had stopped being hurt by it years ago. He knew what the neighbors said. Strange, odd, that boy who never talks. His mother had tried to shield him from it, but Albert heard whispers the way he heard everything too clearly, too completely. At 12, he'd overheard Mrs. Rodriguez tell another neighbor that Jennifer was wasting her life raising a boy who'd never amount to anything. Albert had gone home and asked his mother if he was a burden. Jennifer had cried, actually cried. Then she'd held his face in her hands and said words he still carried like a talisman. "You are not a burden, you are my purpose. And one day, the world will see what I've always seen, that you're extraordinary." Albert wanted to believe her. But extraordinary people didn't live in cramped apartments fixing neighbors' laptops for free. Extraordinary people didn't drop out of community college. Extraordinary people didn't hide from a world that had never figured out what to do with them. He was just Albert. Smart, maybe. Useful, occasionally. But not extraordinary. Never that. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been the person people cross the street to avoid, or the one they underestimate before you even open your mouth, leave a comment with one word: seen. Because that's what we're doing here. We're seeing each other. Every single one of you watching this right now has been underestimated by someone. But you're not invisible here. Hit that like button if this story is reminding you of your own. You matter, and your story deserves to be told. By noon, Albert had finished 3 projects. Mrs. Chen's laptop, a predictive maintenance algorithm for subway systems that no one had asked for, and a complete redesign of the building's network security. The super had mentioned last month that someone kept hacking their Wi-Fi. Albert had fixed it in 20 minutes, but he'd never told anyone. He just liked knowing the problem was solved. Jennifer found him at his desk, staring at code that would have made MIT professors weep. "You need to eat," she said. "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten since yesterday." Albert glanced at the clock, genuinely surprised. Time did that sometimes disappeared when he was working. Hours collapsed into minutes. The world outside his screens ceased to exist. "I'll eat later," he promised. Jennifer didn't move. She had that look, the one that meant she was about to say something he wouldn't want to hear. "Albert, baby, have you thought more about applying to those programs I showed you? The ones at the tech companies?" His stomach tightened. "Mom, you're brilliant. You could be doing this work professionally. Getting paid. Getting recognized." "I don't want to be recognized." The words came out sharper than he intended. "I just want to be left alone." Jennifer's expression crumpled slightly, and guilt crashed through Albert like a wave. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean." "No." Jennifer sat on the edge of his bed. "I'm sorry. I push too hard sometimes. I want the world to see you the way I see you. The world doesn't see people like me, Mom. It tolerates us, and only when we're useful." The sadness in his mother's eyes made Albert want to take the words back, but they were true. He'd learned that lesson early and often through teachers who called him difficult, through classmates who called him weird, through a world that had decided he was broken before he'd ever had a chance to prove otherwise. "You're not broken," Jennifer whispered, reading his mind the way only she could. Albert didn't answer, because some days, he wasn't sure she was right. At 4:30 p.m., Jennifer turned on the television. She usually avoided the news, too much noise, too much chaos, too many reminders of a life she'd walked away from. But today, something pulled her to it. Maybe Paul's phone call, maybe instinct. The anchor's voice filled their small living room. Breaking news in the business world tonight. Billionaire CEO Robert Capps remains hospitalized following a dramatic collapse during yesterday's shareholder meeting. Sources close to Capps Global say the board is demanding immediate succession planning, sparking speculation about the future of the tech empire. Jennifer's hand found the remote. Clicked it off. Silence rushed back in. Albert appeared in the doorway, watching her carefully. "That's him, isn't it?" Albert asked. "The man from the phone call." Jennifer nodded, not trusting her voice. "Paul Mendoza said they needed to talk about him. And me." Albert stepped closer. "Who is he, Mom?" Jennifer had spent 20 years avoiding this conversation. 20 years building a life where Robert Capps was nothing more than a ghost she'd buried. But ghosts didn't stay buried forever. "He's a prize." A knock at the door interrupted her. Sharp, confident, demanding. Jennifer and Albert both froze. "You expecting someone?" Albert asked. "No." Another knock, louder this time. Jennifer's heart hammered as she walked to the door, Albert trailing behind her. She looked through the peephole and felt the ground tilt beneath her. Standing in the hallway, looking exhausted and determined and 20 years too late, was Robert Capps. In the flesh. At her door. "Mom?" Albert's voice was quiet, uncertain. "Who is it?" Jennifer's hand trembled on the doorknob. Because behind that door was the man who'd called her too old. The man who'd abandoned their son before he was born. The man whose empire was crumbling, and who now finally needed the boy he'd thrown away. And Jennifer had no idea whether to open the door or slam it in his face forever. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next would change everything. And in that moment, with Robert Capps on one side of the door and Albert Caballero on the other, 20 years of silence was about to shatter. The question wasn't whether Robert would apologize. The question was whether Jennifer would let him. Jennifer's hand stayed frozen on the doorknob for 3 seconds that felt like 3 lifetimes. Behind her, Albert stood perfectly still, watching, waiting, reading her body language, the way he read everything, with an attention to detail that missed nothing. "Mom?" His voice was quiet. "Careful. Who is it?" Jennifer took a breath that burned her lungs. Then she opened the door. Robert Capps looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he still had that commanding height, those broad shoulders that filled expensive suits. But standing in the dim hallway of her modest apartment building, surrounded by peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, Robert looked diminished. Mortal. Human in a way he'd never allowed himself to be 20 years ago. His eyes met hers, and Jennifer watched him try to find words. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Good, she thought viciously. Let him struggle. Jennifer. Her name came out rough, unpracticed, like he'd forgotten how it felt in his mouth. "I need to talk to you." No, the word was ice. "Please. It's important. I don't care." Jennifer started to close the door, but Robert's hand shot out, stopping it. "It's about Albert." Jennifer's blood went cold. Behind her, she felt Albert stiffen. "You don't get to say his name," Jennifer said quietly, and the fury in her voice made Robert flinch. "You don't get to show up after 20 years and say his name like you have any right to it." "I know." Robert's jaw tightened. "I know I have no right, but the company, I don't care about your company, is failing. And the board wants Albert. They've done their research, Jennifer. They know what he's capable of." Silence crashed through the hallway like thunder. Albert stepped forward, close enough now that Robert could see him for the first time. Jennifer felt her son's presence beside her, solid, quiet, protective despite his confusion. Robert's eyes shifted to Albert, and Jennifer watched something break in his expression. Recognition. Horror. Regret so deep, it looked like drowning. Because Albert had Robert's eyes, those same storm-gray eyes that could cut through boardrooms and dismantle competitors. But where Robert's eyes were cold and calculating, Albert's held something Robert had never possessed. Kindness. "So you're the famous Robert Capps," Albert said. And his voice was calmer than Jennifer expected. Clinical. Observational. The man who built Capps Global from nothing. Forbes billionaire. Technological visionary. He paused, tilting his head slightly. And my mother's biggest mistake. The words hung in the air like a slap. Robert's face went pale. Albert, I don't. Jennifer stepped between them, a wall of maternal fury. Don't you dare speak to him. You wanted to see him? You've seen him. Now leave. Jennifer, please, leave. Her voice cracked. Before I call security. There is no security in this building, Robert said quietly. And the observation felt like an indictment, a reminder of everything Jennifer had lost, everything she'd been forced to build alone. Then leave before I make you leave myself. Robert looked at her, really looked at her, and Jennifer saw him cataloging the differences, the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 20 years ago, the gray threading through her dark hair, the exhaustion she carried like a second skeleton. You look, Robert started. Old? Jennifer's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Isn't that what you said? That I was too old to give you an heir? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, Robert? Jennifer stepped forward, and Robert actually stepped back. When you looked at me pregnant, terrified, asking for nothing but honesty, what exactly did you mean when you said I couldn't give you what you needed? The board? The board? Jennifer's voice rose. You blame the board? You were the CEO, Robert. You could have told them anything, done anything. But you chose image over truth, power over people. And me? She gestured to the cramped hallway, the life she'd built from ruins. I was collateral damage. Robert's hands clenched at his sides. I made a mistake. You made a choice. I was wrong. You were cruel. Jennifer's eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. Not for him, never for him. Do you know what I did the night I left Caps Global? I sat in my car for 3 hours trying to figure out how I'd tell my mother I was pregnant and alone, trying to calculate if I could afford prenatal care and rent, trying to convince myself that my baby would be okay without a father. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And you know what the worst part was? I kept checking my phone, hoping you'd call, hoping you'd changed your mind, hoping you'd realize what you were throwing away. Jennifer, you never called. The words landed like stones. Robert's jaw worked silently. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I told myself you were better off, that a child deserved a different kind of father, that I wasn't capable of. You were right about one thing, Jennifer interrupted. Albert did deserve a different kind of father. He deserved someone who showed up, someone who cared, someone who saw him as more than a liability to be managed. Behind her, Albert was too quiet. Jennifer knew that silence, it was the silence of a boy absorbing information that would reshape his entire understanding of himself. She'd wanted to protect him from this, from Robert, from the truth that his father hadn't wanted him. But the past had come knocking, and there was nowhere left to hide. I need to speak with him, Robert said. With Albert. The board has given me 6 months to name a successor, and absolutely not. He's my son. He's my son. Jennifer's voice was steel. You're just the man whose DNA he happens to share. You have no claim to him, no right to ask anything of him. The company needs him. The company that called me irrelevant, that whispered I was too old, that erased me like I'd never existed. Jennifer stepped closer, and Robert actually backed against the hallway wall. That company can burn to the ground for all I care. I'm not asking for me, I'm asking for yourself. Jennifer's eyes were merciless. You're always asking for yourself, Robert. It's the only language you speak. Albert's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Can I ask a question? Both adults turned to him. Albert stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, that careful blankness he wore around strangers. But Jennifer saw the tremor in his hands, the slight tension in his jaw, the way he'd positioned himself near the doorway, like he might need to escape. Did you know about me? Albert asked Robert. When my mother was pregnant, did she tell you? Robert hesitated, and in that hesitation, Jennifer saw him calculating, considering what answer would serve him best. She'd forgotten how much she hated that about him. Yes, Robert finally said. She told me. And you chose not to be involved. I thought, Robert stopped, then seemed to decide on honesty. I thought she was better off without me. No. Albert's voice was soft, but certain. The accuracy of it made Robert flinch. Albert studied him for another long moment, and Jennifer watched her son do what he always did, collect data, analyze patterns, solve the puzzle in front of him. You don't look sick, Albert observed, Paul Mendoza said you collapsed, but you're standing fine. Your color's good. Your breathing's steady. He paused. So this isn't about you needing help. This is about your company needing help. And you're desperate enough to ask the son you abandoned for 20 years. Robert said nothing. What could he say? Albert nodded slowly, like Robert had just confirmed a hypothesis. That's what I thought. He looked at Jennifer. Mom, I'm going back inside. You don't have to deal with this. Albert, Robert started. Don't. Albert's voice was still soft, still polite. But there was steel underneath it now. I don't know you. You don't know me. And whatever you're asking for, the answer is no. He turned and walked back into the apartment, closing his bedroom door with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Jennifer and Robert stood alone in the hallway. He's remarkable, Robert whispered. Yes, he is. Jennifer's voice was ice. And you have no idea what it took to get him here. What I sacrificed. What he endured. The world called him strange, Robert. Slow. Useless. Do you know how many times I had to convince my brilliant, beautiful boy that he wasn't broken? Robert's eyes were wet. Jennifer. Every single day, her voice cracked. Every single day, I had to rebuild what the world tried to tear down. And you? You were too busy building your empire to even open the file I sent you. The file showing you who Albert was. What he could do. I know. Robert's voice was barely audible. Paul told me. I know. You didn't lose an heir, Robert. You threw one away. And now that your empire is crumbling, now that you finally need something only he can give, now you show up. She stepped back toward her door. You're 20 years too late. If you're watching this, and you've ever had to say words like that to someone who wronged you, if you've ever stood your ground and finally told someone the truth they didn't want to hear, drop a comment and share your story. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let people rewrite history. This community is here for you. We see you. And if this moment of justice hit you the way it just hit me, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Because vindication, it's beautiful when it finally comes. I know I don't deserve. You don't deserve anything from us. Jennifer's hand found the doorknob. Not forgiveness, not help, not even this conversation. But I gave it to you anyway. Because unlike you, I believe people deserve honesty. Even when it hurts. Robert looked broken. Smaller than ever. Good, Jennifer thought again. If you truly want to make this right, Jennifer said quietly, leave us alone. Let Albert live his life without being dragged into your mess. Let him be extraordinary on his own terms, not yours. She started to close the door. What if I can't fix this without him? Robert's voice was desperate. What if the company falls, and then let it fall? Jennifer met his eyes one last time. You built that empire on ambition and sacrifice. Maybe it's time you learned what it feels like to be the one sacrificed. She closed the door, locked it, and finally let herself cry. Behind his bedroom door, Albert sat with his back against the wall, his hands shaking, his brilliant mind trying to process what he'd just learned. The father who'd never wanted him, now needed him. And the question Albert couldn't stop asking himself was the one that terrified him most. Did that change anything? The Cap's global boardroom had never felt this cold. Robert sat at the head of the table, his table, the one he'd sat at for 23 years, and watched his empire cannibalize itself in real time. Stock is down 19%. Marcus Chen, the head of investor relations, didn't bother softening the blow. We've had 17 calls from major shareholders demanding answers. 3 are threatening to pull out entirely. The media's calling it a leadership crisis, added Sarah Kim from Public Relations. Her laptop displayed a dozen headlines, each more damaging than the last. Cap's in chaos. Billionaire's empire crumbling. Is Robert Cap's finished? Robert's jaw tightened. 48 hours. That's all it had taken for whispers of his collapse to metastasize into full-scale panic. What about the succession plan? This came from Gerald Whitmore, the oldest board member, the man who'd been there when Robert was still pitching ideas from a garage. The board gave you 6 months. It's been 2 days, and we're already fielding questions. I'm working on it. Working on it isn't good enough. Gerald leaned forward, and Robert saw something in his expression he'd never seen before. Doubt. We need a name, Robert. We need stability. I said I'm working on it. The room fell silent. Robert's tone had been sharp enough to draw blood, and everyone felt it. Paul Mendoza, sitting to Robert's right, cleared his throat carefully. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. It wasn't a suggestion. The board members filed out like mourners leaving a funeral, and Robert was left alone with Paul in the too-quiet room. You went to see them, Paul said. Not a question. Yes. And? Robert's hands clenched on the table. She told me to leave. Albert wants nothing to do with me, and I don't blame either of them. So what now? I don't know. Robert's voice was hollow. For the first time in my life, Paul, I genuinely don't know. Paul studied him for a long moment, and Robert had the uncomfortable feeling of being dissected, analyzed, found wanting. Then figure it out, Paul said quietly. Because you're not the only one who'll lose everything when this company falls. He stood and walked out, leaving Robert alone with his failures. Darlene Ashworth Capps had built her life on careful construction. The right clothes, the right smile, the right amount of concern when photographed at charity galas. For 15 years, she'd been Mrs. Robert Capps, a role she'd perfected with the precision of a Broadway actress hitting her mark every single night. But now, sitting in the sunroom of their estate, with her phone clutched in perfectly manicured hands, Darlene felt the entire structure beginning to crack. Mystery here could save Capps Global, screamed the headline on page 6. She read it 3 times, each word burning deeper. Sources close to the company suggest Robert Capps has a previously unknown son, Albert Caballero, 20, who may be positioned to take over the tech empire. The revelation has sent shockwaves through both business and social circles. Albert Caballero. Jennifer Caballero. The names tasted like poison. Darlene had known, of course. You didn't marry a man like Robert without learning his secrets. She'd known about Jennifer, the brilliant executive who'd left abruptly 20 years ago, the whispers that followed, the child Robert refused to acknowledge. But knowing and dealing with were 2 entirely different problems. If Albert became the heir, if Robert publicly claimed him, where did that leave Darlene? The woman who couldn't give Robert a child. The wife who'd become decorative rather than essential. The carefully constructed identity that would crumble the moment the world had someone new to worship. Her phone buzzed. A text from Vivian Ashworth, her closest friend and most reliable gossip source. Darling, are you seeing this? Do you need me? Darlene typed back quickly. I'm fine. Handle this quietly. Then, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she'd hoped never to use. Richard Cross, the public relations consultant who specialized in making problems disappear. She hit call. Darlene. Richard's voice was smooth as oil. I was wondering when you'd reach out. I need you to find out everything about Albert Caballero. Education, employment, medical history, criminal record, anything that could be problematic. Already on it. I'll have a file to you by morning. Good. Darlene's voice hardened. And Richard? I need options. Ways to ensure this boy is seen as what he is, a liability, not a legacy. Understood. Leave it to me. Darlene ended the call and stared out at the perfectly manicured gardens. Robert had built this empire. She'd helped him maintain it, standing beside him through scandals and setbacks, playing the perfect wife, even when their marriage had become nothing more than a business arrangement. She'd be damned if she let some unknown boy raised in obscurity by a woman Robert had discarded take what she'd helped build. Albert Caballero had no idea what he was stepping into, but he was about to learn. Robert sat in his home office at 2 a.m., surrounded by files he'd spent 6 hours pulling from storage. Jennifer's employment records, board meeting minutes from 20 years ago, medical documentation, emails, reports. He was looking for something, anything that would explain how he'd made such a catastrophic mistake, how he'd looked at a woman he respected, maybe even loved, and convinced himself she was too old to carry his child. The memory felt foreign now, hollow, like it belonged to someone else entirely. But the evidence was here somewhere. He just had to find. Robert stopped. His hands froze on a document dated 3 weeks before Jennifer told him she was pregnant. A medical report, signed by Dr. Harrison Vaught. Continue. Capps Global's corporate physician. Subject: Jennifer Caballero, confidential health assessment. Significant concerns regarding age-related fertility complications. High-risk pregnancy factors. Recommendation: unsuitable for childbearing, at current age, 43. Robert read it once, twice, 3 times. The words blurred together, and suddenly, he was back in his office 20 years ago, looking at this exact report, remembering the fear it had planted. The certainty that Jennifer couldn't give him what he needed. But something was wrong. The signature looked off. The letterhead was slightly misaligned. The date formatting didn't match other documents from that year. Robert's blood went cold. He grabbed his phone and called Dr. Vaught's office. It was the middle of the night, but Robert didn't care. He needed. "This is Dr. Vaught's service. How may I direct your call? I need to speak with Dr. Vaught immediately. This is Robert Capps." "I'm sorry, Mr. Capps, but Dr. Vaught passed away 8 years ago from a heart attack." The room tilted. "What? He had a heart attack. Is there another physician I can connect you with?" Robert ended the call, his hand shaking. Dead. The doctor was dead, which meant Robert couldn't verify, couldn't confirm. He looked at the report again with new eyes, searching for other inconsistencies. And there they were, small details that felt wrong, phrases that didn't match Dr. Vaught's usual language, medical terminology used incorrectly. This wasn't real. This report, the one that had convinced him Jennifer was too old, too risky, too unsuitable, was a forgery. Robert's mind raced backward, connecting dots he'd been too blind to see. The board members who'd pushed him to distance himself from Jennifer. The whispers about protecting the company's image. The convenient timing of the report arriving just before Jennifer told him about the pregnancy. Someone had planted this. Someone had manipulated him. And he'd let it happen. Robert stood abruptly, papers scattering. He needed to know who. He needed to understand. A knock at the office door made him spin. Paul stood in the doorway, looking older than Robert had ever seen him. "You found it," Paul said quietly. It wasn't a question. "You knew." Robert's voice was deadly calm. "You knew this was fake." "I suspected. I couldn't prove it." Paul stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "But yes, I knew someone on the board wanted Jennifer gone." "Who?" "Gerald Whitmore, Marcus Chen, maybe others." Paul's expression was grim. Jennifer was too good, Robert. Too smart. Too influential. They saw her as a threat to their power structure. When they learned she was pregnant, they saw an opportunity to destroy her, to remove her, Paul corrected. "And you let them do it. Not because you were malicious, but because you were afraid. Afraid of the board. Afraid of public perception. Afraid of anything that might threaten what you'd built." Robert sank into his chair, the full weight of his failure crushing him. "I threw her away based on a lie. Yes. I abandoned my son based on a lie. Yes. And you knew." Robert looked up, and there was something broken in his expression. "Why didn't you tell me?" Paul's jaw tightened. "I tried. You wouldn't listen. You were so convinced the board was right, so desperate to protect your image, that you couldn't see what was happening. So I did the only thing I could." "What?" "I helped Jennifer leave." Paul's voice was steady, unflinching. "I made sure she had savings she didn't know about. I anonymously paid for Albert's medical expenses when he was young. I sent opportunities her way when I could, because if you weren't going to protect them, Robert, someone had to." The words hung between them like an indictment. Robert felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd built walls around for decades. Pride, maybe, or control, or the illusion that he'd been the hero of his own story. "I destroyed everything," Robert whispered. "Yes. I can't fix this." "Probably not." Paul walked to the door, then paused. "But you can try. Not for the company. Not for the board. Not even for yourself. You can try for them. For Jennifer and Albert. Because they deserve better than what you gave them 20 years ago." Paul left. Robert sat alone in his office, surrounded by evidence of his greatest failure, and made a decision. He would fix this. He would expose the board members who'd manipulated him. He would dismantle the lie that had destroyed Jennifer's career and Albert's childhood. He would burn his own empire to the ground, if that's what it took to make this right. But even as he made that vow, Robert knew the truth Paul had left unspoken. Fixing something didn't erase the damage. And wanting to do better didn't mean he deserved the chance. Miles away, Darlene received an email from Richard Cross with a subject line that made her smile. Leverage. Inside Caps Global. Board members began making quiet phone calls about protecting their interests. And in a modest apartment, Albert lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to stop thinking about the man at the door, who'd looked at him with such desperate regret. The war for Robert Capps' empire had begun, and none of them knew yet how much blood it would cost. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a man in a suit, too expensive for their neighborhood. Jennifer signed for it with hands that already knew this was trouble. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored letterhead, the kind that cost more per page than most people spent on groceries, embossed with the Capps Global logo. And beneath it, a handwritten note in Robert's precise script. Albert, I'm offering you the position of successor to Capps Global. Full authority, complete control, the resources to build whatever you want. I know I have no right to ask, but I'm asking anyway. Robert. Jennifer read it twice, then handed it to Albert without a word. He was at his desk, as always, surrounded by screens and half-finished projects. He took the letter, scanned it with those sharp gray eyes, and then did something Jennifer didn't expect. He laughed. Not the cruel, mocking laugh of someone relishing another's desperation, but the stunned, almost sad laugh of someone confronted with something so absurd it defied rational response. He's serious, Albert said, setting the letter down like it might contaminate him. He actually thinks I'd say yes. What do you want to do? Jennifer asked carefully. Albert looked at her, really looked at her, and Jennifer saw the question beneath his question. What do you want me to do? I want you to do whatever feels right to you, Jennifer said firmly. Not for him, not for me, for you. Then the answer's no. Albert turned back to his screens. I don't want his company. I don't want his legacy. And I definitely don't want to spend the rest of my life cleaning up messes made by people who thought I was useless. Jennifer's chest loosened with relief she hadn't known she was holding. Okay, she said softly. Then we tell him no. We don't tell him anything. Albert's fingers resumed their dance across the keyboard. We ignore him. Eventually, he'll figure it out. But Robert didn't figure it out. 3 days later, he showed up again, this time with Paul Mendoza beside him like a second and a witness. Jennifer opened the door with her arms crossed, blocking the entrance like a sentry. He said no, she stated flatly. He didn't say anything, Robert countered. I never got a response. Silence is a response. Jennifer, please. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. The answer is still. I'll talk to him. Both adults turned. Albert stood behind Jennifer, looking calmer than anyone had a right to look when facing the father who'd abandoned them. Albert, you don't have to, Jennifer started. I know. Albert stepped past her, meeting Robert's eyes directly. 5 minutes. Out here. She doesn't have to listen to this. Jennifer hesitated, then squeezed Albert's shoulder and stepped back inside, but only far enough to keep the door cracked. She wasn't about to leave her son alone with Robert Capps. Albert crossed his arms, mirroring his mother's earlier stance, and waited. Robert seemed to struggle with where to start. Finally, he said simply, I'm offering you everything. I heard you the first time. Then why didn't you respond? Because I don't owe you a response. Albert's voice was steady, almost clinical. You don't know me. You didn't want me. And I don't trust you. The words landed with surgical precision, and Robert flinched. You're right, Robert said quietly. I don't know you, but I know your work. Paul showed me your algorithms, your systems, your solutions to problems my entire engineering team couldn't solve. You're brilliant, Albert. You could. Stop. Albert held up a hand. You're doing the thing people always do. You see what I can do, and assume that's all I am. A tool. A solution. Something useful. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Albert stepped closer, and there was something almost dangerous in his calm. Because from where I'm standing, you're not offering me an opportunity. You're offering me a mess, your mess. And expecting me to fix it because you finally realized I'm not useless after all. Robert's jaw tightened. The company is failing. Thousands of people will lose their jobs if... That's not my problem. It could be your legacy. I don't want your legacy. Albert's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composure. I don't want your company, or your empire, or your approval, 20 years too late. I just want to be left alone. Paul, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. What if it wasn't about Robert? Both Albert and Robert turned to him. What if it wasn't about legacy or approval or making amends? Paul continued, looking directly at Albert. What if it was just about the problem itself? Albert's expression shifted subtle, but Jennifer saw it. Curiosity. The same look he got when encountering a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. What problem? Albert asked carefully. Paul pulled a tablet from his briefcase and held it out. These problems. 20 minutes later, Albert sat on the apartment floor, with Paul's tablet balanced on his knees, Jennifer beside him, both of them staring at cascading system failures that read like a technical apocalypse. This is, Albert scrolled through pages of data, his eyes moving faster than Jennifer could track. This is catastrophic. Who designed this infrastructure? Various teams over 20 years, Paul said from the doorway. It's been patched and bandaged so many times that no one understands the full system anymore. It's not a system, it's architectural chaos. Albert zoomed in on a network diagram. These dependencies are circular. Any single failure would cascade into... He stopped. Calculations running behind his eyes. You're looking at a complete infrastructure collapse within 4 months. Maybe 3. Our analysis said 6, Paul observed. Your analysis is wrong. Albert looked up, and there was something almost excited in his expression despite himself. You're not accounting for the compounding effect of legacy code degradation. See here, he turned the tablet toward Paul, pointing at sections Jennifer couldn't begin to comprehend. And here, these systems are talking to each other in languages that shouldn't be compatible. It's a miracle it hasn't failed already. Can it be fixed? Paul asked quietly. Albert was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through possibilities, algorithms, solutions. Maybe, he finally said, but it would require rebuilding from the ground up, completely restructuring the... He stopped himself, and Jennifer watched her son realize what Paul had done, shown him a problem he couldn't ignore. Albert looked at Paul with something like respect and irritation mixed together. That was manipulative. Yes, Paul agreed. But was I wrong? Albert didn't answer. He just stared at the tablet, his fingers twitching like they wanted to start coding solutions right there on the floor. Jennifer had seen this look before. It was the look Albert got when he found Mrs. Chen's laptop vulnerable, when he discovered the building's Wi-Fi breach, when he encountered something broken that he and only he could fix. Baby, Jennifer said softly, you don't have to do this. Not for Robert, not for anyone. I know. Albert's voice was distant, distracted. But if I don't... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. If he didn't fix it, thousands of people would lose their jobs. An entire infrastructure would collapse. Problems would multiply into catastrophes. And Albert Caballero, who'd spent his whole life fixing things people didn't even know were broken, couldn't walk away from that. Even if he wanted to. Albert didn't sleep that night. Jennifer heard him pacing in his room, the quiet clicking of his keyboard, the occasional frustrated sound that meant he'd hit a wall in his thinking. At 4 a.m., she brought him tea and found him surrounded by printouts of system diagrams, handwritten notes covering every available surface. You're going to do it, she said, not a question. Albert looked up at her with exhausted, conflicted eyes. I don't want to. I know. I don't want to help him. I know. But if I don't... Albert gestured helplessly at the chaos around him. Mom, this isn't just bad code. This is people's livelihoods. Their families, and I can see the solution. It's right there in my head, fully formed, and His voice broke. I can't just ignore it. That's not who I am. Jennifer sat beside him on the floor. Pulling him into a hug he melted into despite being 20 years old and brilliant, and supposedly grown. Then don't ignore it, she whispered. But do it on your terms, not his. At 9 a.m., Albert called the number on Robert's business card. Robert answered on the first ring. I'll meet with your board, Albert said without preamble. Once. I'll look at your systems. I'll tell you if they can be fixed. But I'm not making any promises, and I'm not doing this for you. Albert, I have conditions. Albert's voice was firm. First, my mother comes with me. Non-negotiable. Second, I meet the board in a neutral location, not your headquarters. Third, if I decide to help, it's because the work matters, not because you asked. Are we clear? Silence on the other end. Then, crystal clear. Good. Have Paul send me the details." Albert hung up before Robert could say anything else. Jennifer looked at her son, her brilliant, stubborn, impossibly kind son, and felt pride and terror in equal measure. "You don't have to do this," she said one more time. "Yeah," Albert replied softly. "I really do." The car arrived at noon, a sleek black sedan with a driver who opened the door like Albert was royalty, instead of a kid from a cramped apartment who'd never owned a suit. Albert stood on the sidewalk in his best jeans and the button-down shirt Jennifer had ironed 3 times, looking at the car like it might bite him. Jennifer stood beside him, her hand finding his. "Last chance to change your mind," she said. "I know. We can just not get in the car." "I know." But Albert was already moving forward, climbing into the back seat with the careful uncertainty of someone entering completely foreign territory. Jennifer followed, and the door closed behind them with a sound like finality. Through the tinted window, their apartment building looked smaller, more fragile, like the life they'd built there was already receding into memory. Albert's hand found hers again, squeezing once. "Mom?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. "What if I'm not ready for this?" Jennifer squeezed back, fierce and certain. "Baby, you've been ready for this your entire life. The world just wasn't ready for you." The car pulled away from the curb, carrying them toward Cap's Global, toward Robert's crumbling empire, toward a confrontation that would either save thousands of people or destroy the fragile peace they'd built. And as Jennifer watched her son's reflection in the window, jaw set, eyes focused, mind already working through problems that hadn't been officially presented yet, she realized something that terrified and amazed her in equal measure. Albert wasn't doing this for Robert. He was doing it because he was exactly who she'd raised him to be. Someone who saw broken things and couldn't help but fix them, even when those things had broken him first. And waiting in the Cap's Global boardroom, Robert sat surrounded by the men who'd manipulated him, the wife who was plotting against him, and the empire he'd built on lies. None of them knew yet that the quiet boy arriving in that car wasn't coming to save them. He was coming to expose exactly what they'd become. The Cap's Global building looked exactly as Jennifer remembered, all glass and steel and architectural arrogance, reflecting clouds like it owned the sky itself. She'd walked out of this building 20 years ago with a cardboard box and shattered dignity. Now she was walking back in with her son beside her and her spine straight as a blade. Albert's hand found hers as they approached the entrance. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Jennifer wanted to lie, wanted to tell him she was fine, that this place held no power over her anymore. But Albert had always been able to read her too well. "No," she admitted, "but I will be." The lobby was exactly the same. Marble floors that clicked under expensive shoes. The massive Cap's Global logo suspended from cables, rotating slowly like a corporate sun. Security guards in crisp uniforms who looked at visitors like potential threats. One of them stepped forward as they approached. "Jennifer Caballero and Albert Caballero," she said before he could ask. "We're expected." The guard checked his tablet, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or surprise that someone from their world would be on Robert Caps's calendar. "Top floor. Mr. Capps is waiting." The elevator ride felt eternal. Jennifer watched the numbers climb 15 floors, 20, 30 each one, carrying them higher into the empire she'd helped build and been erased from. Albert was quiet beside her, but his fingers drummed against his thigh in the pattern Jennifer recognized. He was nervous, running calculations, preparing himself for whatever came next. "Remember," Jennifer said softly, "you don't owe them anything, not performance, not proof, not—" "I know." Albert's voice was steady, despite the drumming fingers. "But I came here to see if I can fix this. So, I need to actually see it." The elevator chimed, 40th floor. The doors opened onto a reception area that screamed old money and new power. And standing there, looking older and more uncertain than Jennifer had ever seen him, was Robert Capps. He took a step forward, then stopped, like he wasn't sure he had permission to approach. "Jennifer," her name sounded like an apology. "Albert, thank you for coming." Jennifer said nothing, just looked at him with eyes that held 20 years of silence. "I wanted to," Robert started. "Before we go into the boardroom, I wanted to say—" "Don't," Jennifer's voice was ice. "Don't apologize, don't explain. Don't try to make this moment about your guilt, or your regret, or your sudden realization that you made a mistake. Robert's mouth closed. "I came here for Albert," Jennifer continued. "Because he asked me to. Not for you. Not for closure. Not for any conversation you think we need to have." She stepped closer. And Robert actually stepped back. "So let's be very clear about something. I didn't forgive you in the hallway, and I'm not forgiving you now. You don't get absolution just because you finally feel bad about what you did. I know I don't deserve. You don't deserve anything from us." Jennifer's words were precise, surgical. "You didn't lose an heir, Robert. You threw one away. And the fact that you're finally looking at what you discarded doesn't make you noble. It makes you desperate." The words landed like physical blows. Albert touched his mother's arm gently. "Mom." The boardroom. Jennifer took a breath, centering herself. Then she nodded. "Lead the way," she said to Robert. The boardroom was exactly as Jennifer remembered. 20 feet of mahogany table, leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that looked like a toy model from this height. And seated around that table were the men who'd erased her. Gerald Whitmore, whose fabricated medical report had destroyed her career. Marcus Chen, who'd never once defended her when the whispers started. Sarah Kim, who'd rewritten press releases to remove Jennifer's contributions. And half a dozen others who'd watched her leave and said nothing. They all stood when Jennifer entered, and she watched recognition ripple through them like an electric shock. "Jennifer," Gerald's voice was carefully neutral. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Jennifer replied. She took a seat at the far end of the table, the seat that had once been hers, and gestured for Albert to sit beside her. Robert took his position at the head of the table, looking like a king presiding over his own execution. "Everyone," Robert said quietly, "this is Albert Caballero, my son." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Marcus leaned forward, studying Albert with undisguised skepticism. "This is the genius we've heard so much about? He looks like a college dropout." Albert said nothing, just met Marcus's gaze with those storm-gray eyes and waited. "Mr. Caballero," Gerald said in the tone people used with children, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. But I think it's important to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. CAPS Global is a multi-billion-dollar operation with infrastructure failures across 17 core systems," Albert said quietly. "Cascade vulnerabilities in your server architecture. Legacy code that's degraded to the point of critical instability. And financial projections that only work if you ignore the compounding failure rate." Silence. Gerald's condescending smile faltered. "You've done your research." "I've looked at the files Paul sent." Albert's voice remained calm, almost clinical. "You have approximately 63 days before your primary systems experience catastrophic failure. Maybe 70, if you're lucky." "Our analysis gave us 6 months, Sarah protested. "Your analysis is wrong." Albert said it without arrogance, just stated it as fact. "You're calculating linear degradation. But system failures don't work linearly. They cascade, exponentially." Marcus exchanged glances with Gerald. "That's a bold claim from someone with no corporate experience." "It's not a claim, it's mathematics." Albert pulled out his tablet, fingers moving across the screen. "Would you like me to show you the modeling?" "What we'd like," Gerald said, with barely concealed irritation, "is to understand what qualifies you to make these assessments. Where did you study? What's your employment history? What credentials? Does it matter?" Albert looked up from his tablet. "You're not asking because you care about credentials. You're asking because you want to disqualify me before I say something that makes you uncomfortable." The accuracy of it made several board members shift in their seats. "We have the right to vet potential successors," Marcus said stiffly. "Then vet this." Albert stood, walked to the massive whiteboard that covered one wall, and picked up a marker. For a moment, he just stared at the blank surface. Jennifer could see him organizing information in his mind, building the architecture of his explanation. Then he started writing. Numbers first, then system diagrams, then lines connecting dependencies, variables, failure points. His handwriting was quick, efficient, covering the board in cascading logic that looked like art and mathematics had a child. He wrote for 3 minutes straight without stopping, without hesitating, without second-guessing a single calculation. The board members watched in silence that shifted from skepticism to confusion to something close to awe. Finally, Albert capped the marker and turned around. This, he gestured to the board, is your actual infrastructure, not the version you've been showing investors, not the sanitized reports. This is reality. He pointed to a cluster of interconnected systems in the upper right. These 12 systems are talking to each other using 3 different programming languages and 4 incompatible protocols. They shouldn't work at all. The fact that they do is essentially held together by digital duct tape and prayer. A few uncomfortable laughs around the table. Albert didn't smile. Here's your cascade failure point. He tapped the center of the diagram. When this system fails, and it will fail, it takes these 6 with it. Those 6 take another 15. Those 15 collapse your entire infrastructure within 48 hours. Can it be prevented? Robert's voice was quiet. Yes. Albert drew a new line across the board. Complete system rebuild. Ground up. New architecture that's actually designed to scale, instead of patched together over 2 decades. You'd need to. He listed 17 specific changes, each one more technically complex than the last. Jennifer watched the board members' expressions shift from skepticism to comprehension to something that looked like hope. When Albert finally stopped, the silence in the room was absolute. Gerald cleared his throat. That's impressive, but implementing something like that would require 6 months if you do it right, 3 if you're willing to take calculated risks. Albert set down the marker. I can give you a complete implementation plan by Friday. Full documentation, resource allocation, risk assessment. And you can actually do this? Sarah asked. And the condescension was gone from her voice now. Rebuild an entire corporate infrastructure? I can design it. You'll need engineers to implement it. Albert shrugged. But yes, I can do it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, reassessing. You're 20 years old. Yes. No degree, no corporate experience. Also yes. And you're telling us you can solve in 6 months what our entire team couldn't solve in years? Albert looked at him directly. I'm telling you I already solved it. Implementation is just details. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Board members leaned toward each other, some excited, some defensive, all of them recalibrating their understanding of the quiet boy they dismissed on sight. Paul Mendoza stood slowly, and the room quieted. He looked at the whiteboard, at the solution laid out in Albert's precise handwriting, then at the board members who'd spent years ignoring problems Albert had untangled in minutes. Gentlemen, Paul said quietly, your successor. The words settled over the room like a benediction. Jennifer watched her son, her brilliant, underestimated, extraordinary son, stand at that whiteboard looking uncomfortable with the attention but certain of his work. And she watched the men who'd called her too old, who'd fabricated reports to destroy her career, who'd dismissed her child before he was born, finally understand what they'd tried so hard to erase. Albert wasn't just capable. He was exceptional, and they had no choice but to bow to it. If you just felt chills watching that moment, if you've been waiting for Albert to show them exactly who he is, hit that like button right now, because this is what happens when the underestimated finally get their moment. And if you know someone who needs to see this story, someone who's been called too much or not enough their whole life, share this video with them. Let them see what happens when quiet brilliance finally gets loud. You're watching something special here. Don't let it end with you. Robert stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried something Jennifer had never heard from him before. Genuine humility. Albert is right, about everything. Robert looked at the board members who'd manipulated him. And if we're going to save this company, we do it his way, on his terms, with his vision. Gerald started to protest. Robert, we can't just hand over. We can, and we will. Robert's voice hardened. Because the alternative is watching everything collapse while we protect our pride. So the question isn't whether Albert becomes my successor. The question is whether you're willing to let him save what you helped destroy. The board members looked at each other, trapped, cornered, out of options. One by one, they nodded. Albert watched it all, with an expression Jennifer couldn't quite read. Not triumphant, not satisfied, just observing. I'll need complete access, Albert said, to all systems, all files, all financial records, no restrictions. Done, Robert said immediately. And I work from home. I'm not moving into an office here. Whatever you need. And my mother gets her name back. Albert's voice was quiet, but absolute. Every project she contributed to, every innovation she helped create, her name goes back in the records. Publicly. Jennifer's breath caught. Robert looked at her, and there was something broken and grateful in his expression. Yes. Absolutely yes. Albert nodded once. Then I'll start Monday. He walked back to Jennifer, took her hand, and together, they stood to leave. As they reached the door, Albert paused and looked back at the room full of executives who'd finally recognized what he was. Oh, he said casually. One more thing. Some of you fabricated medical documents to destroy my mother's career. I found the evidence. Paul has copies. So while I'm rebuilding your systems, I suggest you start thinking about how you'll rebuild your reputations after the truth comes out. He smiled small, sharp, devastating. Because it's definitely coming out. Then he walked out, leaving behind a boardroom full of powerful men who just realized they'd made an enemy of the one person they desperately needed. And as the door closed behind them, Jennifer squeezed her son's hand and whispered 4 words she'd been waiting 20 years to say. I'm so proud of you. The news broke before Albert and Jennifer even made it home. Cap's global name's mystery heir. Robert Cap's secret son to save failing empire. Who is Albert Caballero? By the time their car pulled up to the apartment building, 17 news outlets had called Jennifer's phone. 23 had emailed. The building super was fielding questions from reporters camped outside like it was a celebrity stakeout. Mom, Albert said quietly, staring at the crowd through tinted windows. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Jennifer squeezed his hand. We don't have to talk to them. We don't owe them anything. I know, but he does. Albert looked at his phone, where Robert's number sat in his recent calls. Waiting. Like Robert himself had been waiting for 20 years. He needs to tell the truth, Albert said. All of it, not just the convenient parts. Inside Cap's global headquarters, Robert sat in his office with Paul and a crisis management team that looked like they'd aged 10 years in 3 hours. The media wants a statement, Sarah Kim said, her usual composure cracking at the edges. We've had 47 interview requests. The board is fielding calls from investors. Stock jumped 9% on the news about Albert. But it'll crash again if we don't control the narrative. Then we control it, Robert said. How? What do we say? Marcus Chen looked panicked. That you had a secret son you abandoned? That you're desperate enough to hand your empire to a 20-year-old college dropout? We tell the truth. Everyone went silent. Robert, Sarah said carefully. The truth is complicated. It opens doors we might not want opened. The doors are already open. Robert stood, and there was something different in his posture. Not the commanding presence he usually carried, but something quieter. Heavier. I'm calling a press conference tomorrow morning, and I'm telling them everything. Paul looked at him sharply. Everything? Everything. Robert met his CFO's eyes. The fabricated medical report. The board members who pushed Jennifer out, my cowardice, all of it. That will destroy careers, Gerald Whitmore said from the corner, and there was genuine fear in his voice, including yours. Good, Robert's voice was steel. Maybe some careers deserve to be destroyed. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Cap's global headquarters. By 9:30, every major news outlet had cameras positioned. Business reporters, technology journalists, entertainment media, hoping for scandal. They filled the conference hall like predators sensing blood. In the front row sat Darlene Ashworth Capps, dressed in ivory that photographed beautifully, her posture perfect, her smile fixed like armor. She'd insisted on being there, insisted on standing by her husband, insisted on playing the role of supportive wife one more time, but her eyes were cold as winter. Robert stepped to the podium at exactly 10 a.m., and the camera flashes were blinding. He gripped the edges of the podium, took a breath, and began. 20 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. The room went silent. Jennifer Caballero was one of the most brilliant executives at Cap's Global. She helped build this company from a struggling startup into what it is today. She was my friend, my colleague, and... He paused, the words clearly difficult. Someone I cared for deeply. Darlene's smile tightened. When Jennifer told me she was pregnant with my child, I panicked. I was told by certain board members that she was too old to carry a healthy pregnancy. I was shown medical documentation that supported this claim. I was advised that acknowledging the child would damage the company's image. Robert's hands trembled against the podium. So I did what cowards do. I chose the company over the person. I chose my reputation over truth. I chose power over responsibility. Reporters leaned forward, pens flying across notepads. Jennifer left Caps Global quietly. She raised our son alone, without support, without recognition, without any help from me. And for 20 years, I told myself I'd made the right choice. Robert looked directly at the cameras, and there was something raw in his expression. I was wrong. About everything. He pulled papers from his jacket pocket, copies of the fabricated medical report, highlighted and annotated. This medical report, which convinced me Jennifer was unfit for pregnancy, was falsified. Created by board members who saw Jennifer as a threat to their power. I've since learned that Dr. Harrison Vaught, whose signature appears here, never wrote this document. He likely never even saw it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I was manipulated. But manipulation is not an excuse. I should have questioned. Should have investigated. Should have chosen the woman carrying my child over corporate politics. In the audience, Gerald Whitmore stood abruptly and walked out. Marcus Chen followed. Their exits were captured by dozens of cameras. Robert didn't stop. Albert Caballero is my son. He is brilliant, compassionate, and capable in ways I never was at his age. Or any age, frankly. Yesterday, he solved infrastructure problems my entire engineering team couldn't crack in years. He did it in minutes. Pride crept into Robert's voice, despite the gravity of the confession. Albert is not a replacement or a desperation move. He is the future of Caps Global, because he deserves to be. Because he earned it. Because he sees solutions where others see impossibilities. Robert's voice cracked slightly. And Jennifer Caballero deserves recognition for everything she contributed to this company. Starting today, her name will be restored to every project, every innovation, every success she helped create. Because erasing her was not just wrong, it was theft. The room erupted with questions, but Robert held up a hand. I know this confession doesn't fix what I broke. I know apologizing publicly doesn't erase 20 years of abandonment. But I wanted Albert and Jennifer to hear me say what I should have said 2 decades ago. He looked directly into the camera, and his next words felt like they were meant for 2 people only. I was wrong. You were never too old. He was never useless. And I am profoundly sorry. Robert stepped back from the podium, ignoring the shouted questions, and walked off the stage. Darlene sat frozen in her seat, her ivory dress suddenly looking like a surrender flag, her perfect smile finally completely shattered. Jennifer watched the press conference from her living room, Albert beside her on the worn couch they'd bought at a secondhand store 12 years ago. When Robert said Jennifer Caballero was one of the most brilliant executives, her hands started shaking. When he said, I chose power over responsibility, she felt 20 years of rage and hurt rise in her throat. When he said, you were never too old, tears started falling. Not the bitter tears of old wounds reopening, but something else entirely. Vindication. Pure, complete, public vindication. The world was hearing what she'd known all along. She'd been wronged. Her career had been stolen. Her contributions had been erased. And none of it had been her fault. Mom. Albert's hand found hers. You okay? Jennifer nodded, unable to speak past the tears. On screen, reporters were dissecting Robert's confession, legal experts discussing potential lawsuits, business analysts predicting stock impacts. The story was exploding in real time. Jennifer's phone buzzed with messages. Colleagues from 20 years ago, friends she'd lost touch with, people apologizing, people saying they'd always known, people wanting to be part of her story now that it had been validated. She ignored them all. Because the only validation that mattered had just happened. Robert Capps, the man who'd built an empire on control and image, had stood in front of the world and admitted he was wrong. That she had been right. That their son was extraordinary. He finally said it, Albert whispered. And Jennifer turned to see her son staring at the replay on his phone. Robert's face frozen mid-confession. The subtitle reading, Albert Caballero is my son. So he finally said it, Albert repeated, and his voice was complicated, not angry, not grateful, just processing. How do you feel? Jennifer asked. Albert was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. It doesn't change anything, really. He's still the man who walked away. But at least now the world knows he was wrong to do it. Albert looked at his mother. And they know you were right. About everything. If you just watched that, and felt your heart break and heal at the same time, if you know what it's like to wait decades for someone to finally admit the truth, comment below and tell me. What truth are you still waiting to hear? Because sometimes putting it into words helps. And this community? We're here to witness it. Hit subscribe if you want more stories where truth finally wins and justice finally comes. Because that's what we do here. We wait for the vindication, and we celebrate when it arrives. Jennifer pulled him into a hug, and they sat there, watching the news cycle devour Robert's confession, watching his empire shift beneath him, watching the truth finally do what truth was supposed to do. Expose, correct, heal. Across the city, in the estate she'd decorated with perfect taste and empty love, Darlene Ashworth Capps packed a suitcase with shaking hands. The press conference had been televised in real time, which meant her friends had seen it. Her mother had seen it. Every person she'd smiled at and entertained and presented her perfect marriage to had just watched her husband confess to having a son with another woman. Not just a son. A brilliant son. A worthy son. The son Darlene could never give him. Her phone rang. Robert's number. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again, and again, and again. Finally, she answered. Don't, she said before he could speak. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't pretend this is anything other than what it is. Darlene, you humiliated me on national television. In front of everyone who matters. I told the truth. You destroyed me for your truth. Her voice rose, years of careful composure finally shattering. Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation? My standing? Everything I built? I'm sorry. No, you're not. You're relieved. Darlene's laugh was sharp. You get to play the repentant father, the man who finally does the right thing. You get redemption. She grabbed her suitcase. And I get to be the wife who wasn't enough. The woman who couldn't give you a child. The placeholder until your real family showed up. That's not fair. Nothing about this is fair, Robert. But I'm done pretending. Done playing the perfect wife for cameras while you rebuild your life with the family you actually wanted. Where are you going? Anywhere you're not. Darlene ended the call, threw her phone on the bed, and walked out of the house she'd lived in for 15 years. The press was already gathering outside. Cameras, questions, flashes. She smiled that practiced. Perfect smile, and got into her car. Let them wonder, she thought. Let Robert explain. She was done being part of his story. That night, Albert sat at his desk designing the infrastructure that would save Capps Global, while Jennifer made tea she didn't drink, and Robert sat alone in his empty house staring at his phone. The world had heard the truth. The consequences were unfolding, and somewhere in the space between confession and forgiveness, three people who'd spent 20 years apart were finally, impossibly, beginning to orbit the same truth. That some mistakes couldn't be unmade. But maybe, just maybe, they could be survived. And as the news cycle continued its feast, as board members resigned and stock fluctuated, and the public debated and judged, one question remained. Could Robert Capps earn back what he'd thrown away? Or had his confession come 20 years too late to matter? 6 months after the press conference, on a Tuesday evening that felt like any other, Jennifer heard a knock at her door. She'd learned to recognize the different knocks. Mrs. Chen's was apologetic. The delivery drivers were impatient. Albert's building manager was authoritative. This knock was uncertain, almost hesitant. Like someone who wasn't sure they had the right to knock at all. Jennifer opened the door and found Robert Capps standing in her hallway, but not the Robert she remembered. This version wore jeans instead of tailored suits. A simple jacket instead of designer labels. And his eyes held something they'd never held before. Humility. Jennifer. Her name came out careful, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. I know I have no right to be here. But I was hoping. Could we talk? Just for a few minutes. Jennifer's first instinct was to say no. To close the door the way she'd wanted to close it 20 years ago. To protect the peace she'd built in the months since Robert's confession had turned their private pain into public spectacle. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the exhaustion in Robert's face. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the understanding that some conversations needed to happen, even when they hurt. 5 minutes, Jennifer said, stepping back to let him in. Robert entered her apartment for the first time, and Jennifer watched him take in the space she'd called home for 2 decades. The worn furniture. The bookshelves Albert had built from salvaged wood. The modest kitchen where she'd raised a genius on a budget that never quite stretched far enough. This was what Robert's choice had cost her, and she wanted him to see it. "I've been going to therapy," Robert said, still standing because she hadn't invited him to sit. 3 times a week, for 5 months. "My therapist says I need to apologize properly, without excuses, without trying to explain away what I did." "Okay," Jennifer crossed her arms. "So apologize." Robert took a breath. "I'm sorry for abandoning you when you needed me most. I'm sorry for choosing my career over you and our child. I'm sorry for believing lies instead of trusting you. I'm sorry for 20 years of silence and cowardice." He paused, and Jennifer saw his hands trembling. "I'm sorry for making you believe you were too old, when the truth was, I was too weak. I'm sorry for letting you raise Albert alone, for missing every moment of his childhood, for not being there when the world called him strange, and you had to be strong enough for both of you." Robert's voice cracked. "I'm sorry for all of it, and I know sorry doesn't fix anything. It doesn't give you back the years I stole. It doesn't erase the pain or make me worthy of forgiveness, but I needed you to hear it anyway." Silence filled the small apartment. Jennifer had imagined this moment countless times over 20 years. Sometimes she pictured herself yelling, sometimes forgiving, sometimes simply closing the door and walking away. But now that it was happening, she felt something unexpected. Not rage, not even satisfaction, just tired. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" Jennifer asked quietly. "It wasn't the money, or raising Albert alone, or even the loneliness." Robert waited. "It was the doubt." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Every time Albert struggled. Every time someone called him odd, or slow, or useless. Every time I wondered if I was doing enough, being enough, giving him what he needed, I thought about you. About how much easier it would have been with a partner, with support, with someone who loved him as much as I did. Jennifer, but then I'd remember that you didn't love him. You didn't even want him. And I'd have to be strong enough for both of us all over again." Jennifer stepped closer. "So, your apology? It's 20 years too late to heal the wounds it left, but I appreciate you saying it anyway." "I don't expect forgiveness," Robert said quickly. I wanted to ask if maybe, someday, I could try to be part of his life. Not as someone with rights or claims, just as someone who wants to know him, if he'll let me. That's not my decision to make. I know. But I needed your permission to ask." Jennifer studied him, this man who'd once held so much power over her life. Now standing in her home, asking for scraps of what he'd thrown away. "You can ask," she said finally. "But if he says no, you accept it. If he sets boundaries, you respect them. If he needs space, you give it. Because this isn't about you earning redemption, Robert. This is about Albert deciding what he wants." "I understand." "Do you?" Jennifer's voice sharpened. "Because the Robert I knew 20 years ago would have tried to control this, to manage it, to turn it into something that served him. I'm trying to be different." "Trying isn't the same as doing." "I know." Robert's shoulders sagged. "That's why I'm asking for a chance to prove it. Not all at once, just slowly, if you'll let me." The apartment door opened, and Albert walked in carrying grocery bags, his headphones around his neck, completely absorbed in whatever he'd been listening to. He looked up and stopped dead when he saw Robert. "Oh." Albert set down the groceries carefully. "I didn't know we were having company. I was just leaving," Robert said quickly. Then, with visible effort, "But Albert, if you have a moment, I'd like to talk to you sometime. Whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready." Albert looked between his mother and Robert, reading the tension like he read everything with careful attention to detail. "What would we talk about?" Albert asked. "Whatever you want. Your work, the company, nothing at all. Robert struggled for words. "I'd like to know you, if you're willing." Albert was quiet for a long moment, and Jennifer held her breath, ready to support whatever he decided. "You left," Albert finally said, "before I was even born, and then you showed up 20 years later because you needed something from me. Yes. That's not a great foundation for a relationship." "No, it's not." Albert tilted his head, studying Robert the way he studied complex problems. "But you did tell the truth, publicly, when it cost you. That means something." Robert's expression flickered with hope. "I'm not ready to call you Dad," Albert continued. "I might never be ready for that. But—" He glanced at Jennifer, who nodded slightly. "You can try. To be around. To be present. To be someone who shows up. I will." "You're late, Robert." Albert's voice was soft but certain. 20 years late, but maybe just late enough. The words hung in the air like a benediction and a warning all at once. Robert's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "Thank you for the chance. I know I don't deserve it." "You don't," Albert agreed, "but I'm giving it to you anyway, because that's who my mom raised me to be." He looked at Jennifer with such pure love that she had to turn away before she started crying. Robert left a few minutes later, and Jennifer and Albert stood in the kitchen together, processing what had just happened. "You didn't have to do that," Jennifer said softly. "I know, but I wanted to see if he meant it, if he'd actually changed. And? I don't know yet." Albert started unpacking groceries. "But I guess we'll find out." 3 months later, Albert stood in the CAPS Global boardroom not as a visitor this time, but as the company's Chief Innovation Officer, a title he'd negotiated specifically because CEO felt too much like inheriting something he hadn't built himself. The infrastructure rebuild was 70% complete. Stock had stabilized. 3 board members had resigned amid the scandal. And the company was slowly, carefully rebuilding its reputation. And Albert, despite his initial reluctance, had discovered something unexpected. He was good at this, not the corporate politics or the image management, but the problem solving, the innovation, the ability to see what others missed and build solutions that actually worked. Jennifer had taken a consulting position part-time, on her terms, with her name on every project. She walked through CAPS Global's halls with her head high, and people who'd once erased her now stepped aside with respect. And Robert? Robert showed up. Every Tuesday evening, he arrived at Jennifer's apartment, never unannounced, never presumptuous, and asked if Albert wanted to grab dinner. Sometimes Albert said yes, sometimes no. Robert accepted both with equal grace. Slowly, carefully, they were building something that looked like understanding, if not quite family. On this particular Tuesday, Jennifer watched from the kitchen as Robert and Albert sat at her dining table, reviewing architectural plans for CAPS Global's next phase. "This dependency here," Albert pointed, "it's creating unnecessary load. What if we restructured it like this?" Robert sketched a modification. "That could work, but you'd need to account for cascade failure, right? What if we built in redundancy?" "Now you're thinking." They worked together with surprising ease, not as father and son, but as 2 minds that respected each other's capabilities. Jennifer stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 20 years. Peace. Not because everything was fixed, not because the pain had disappeared, but because finally, after all this time, the truth was visible. Albert had never been useless. He'd just been unseen. And now, watching her brilliant son discuss innovations with the father who'd finally learned to show up, Jennifer whispered the words she'd carried like a secret for 2 decades. He was never useless, he was just unseen. Robert looked up, catching her eye across the room. He nodded once in acknowledgement, an agreement, maybe even an apology for every year he'd been blind. Albert, absorbed in the plans, didn't notice the exchange. He just kept working, kept solving, kept being exactly who Jennifer had always known he was. Extraordinary. And as the evening light filtered through the windows of her modest apartment, Jennifer realized something that felt like victory and forgiveness and new beginnings, all wrapped into one. Some families were born. Some were chosen. And some, the rarest, most precious kind, were rebuilt from broken pieces by people brave enough to try again. This was theirs. Imperfect, complicated, hard-won. But finally, impossibly real. If you've ever been told you were too old, too late, or not enough, if you've raised a child the world didn't understand, or if you've been that child yourself, this story was for you. Because sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who change everything. And sometimes, second chances come exactly when they're needed most. Thank you for being here, for staying until the end, for believing that broken things can be rebuilt, and that being unseen doesn't mean being worthless. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join this community. Because we're building something here, a place where women's stories matter, where vindication is celebrated, and where truth always wins in the end. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment and tell me your story. And remember, you matter, your story matters, and you're exactly where you need to be. We'll see you in the next one, where another woman who was dismissed, underestimated, and erased finally gets the justice she deserves. Because that's what we do here. We witness, we validate, we celebrate, and we never, ever forget that being unseen just means the world wasn't looking hard enough.